Our second panel begins with Rhea Combs, curator of film and photography at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. She also serves as the head of the museum's Earl W. and Amanda Stafford Center of African American Media Arts. Prior to joining the museum, Combs taught visual culture, film, race, and gender courses at Chicago State University, Lewis and Clark College, and Emory University. Additionally, Combs has independently and successfully curated film exhibitions nationally and internationally for the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City, the National Black Programming Consortium, and the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, to name a few. She has also worked as the assistant curator for the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art in Atlanta and as public programs educator at the Chicago Historical Society, now Chicago Historical Museum. Combs received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Howard University, a Master of Arts degree from Cornell University, and a doctorate from Emory University. Her writings have been featured in anthologies, academic journals, and exhibition catalogs on a range of topics including African American female filmmakers, Black popular culture, visual aesthetics, filmmaking, and photography. Combs' current exhibitions and projects, respectively, at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, include the museum's inaugural photography show, Everyday Beauty, selections from the photography and film collection, Rising Up, Hale Woodruff's murals at Talladega College, Through the African American Lens, selections from the permanent collection of Namak, and the photography book series Double Exposure, which includes Through the African American Lens, a survey of Namak's photography collection, Civil Rights and Struggle for Equality, African American Women, Picturing Children, and Fighting for Freedom. Our second speaker, Richard J. Powell, is the John Spencer Bassett Professor of Art History at Duke University, where he has taught since 1989. After receiving his BA at Morehouse, he earned the MFA with specialization in printmaking from Howard University. Shortly thereafter, Powell completed a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship in Museum Education at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. And after a brief teaching stint in Virginia, he entered Yale University, where he received the MA in African American Studies and the M Philosophy and PhD in the History of Art. While attending Yale, Powell is awarded a Fulbright scholarship, which enabled him to conduct dissertation research at Copenhagen's National Museum of Denmark and throughout several Scandinavian countries. It was during Powell's time at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that he became interested in art criticism and organizing art exhibition. In 1979, the Studio Museum in Harlem enlisted Powell as guest curator for Impressions, Expressions, Black American Graphics, one of the first art museum survey of works by African American printmakers. Maybe that's when you overlapped with Deb Willis we talked about earlier. After Powell's year in Denmark, he settled in Washington, D.C., where he completed his dissertation under the auspices of Smithsonian American Art Museum. He became director of programs for the Washington Project for the Arts, one of several alternative art spaces in the 1980s, whose contemporary exhibitions and programs fueled that era's culture wars. Powell's curatorial contributions to this historical moment ranged from a retrospective exhibition of the Washington, D.C.-based Harlem Renaissance artist James Lacine Wells to arranging cutting-edge art installations and performances by conceptual artist David Hammonds, poet gay activist Essex Hemphill, and legendary dancer choreographer Katherine Dunham. As a visual artist, Powell has exhibited his prints and drawings in group and solo exhibitions in the U.S. and abroad. In the 1980s, worked as a periodical and book illustrator, most notably for the Massachusetts Review, Callaloo, Roseanne Bell, Betty Parker, and the Beverly Guy Sheftall's Sturdy Black Bridges, Visions of Black Women in Literature, and Jessica Hagedorn's Pet Food and Tropical Apparitions. His works are in the permanent collections of the Bradford Art Galleries and Museums, the Library of Congress, the Yale University Art Gallery, and in many private hands. His current art project is an illustrated and historically themed novel. Richard J. Powell, recognized authority on African American art and culture, and a frequent lecturer and media commentator on the topic of both in the U.S. abroad, has organized numerous art exhibitions, most notably The Blues Aesthetic, Black Culture and Modernism, Rhapsodies in Black, The Art of the Harlem Renaissance, To Conserve a Legacy, American Art at Historically Black Colleges and Universities, Back to Black, Art, Cinema, and the Racial Imaginary, and Archibald Motley, Jazz Age Modernist. Among the major museums where his curated exhibitions have been presented are the Phillips Academy's Addison Gallery of American Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, London's Whitechapel Art Gallery, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Along with teaching courses in American art, the arts of the African diaspora, and contemporary visual studies, he has written extensively on topics ranging from primitivism to postmodernism, including such titles as Homecoming, The Art and Life of William H. Johnson, Black Art, A Cultural History, which will be here again, and Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture, which is very hard to find, so hang on to yours if you have it. From 2007 until 2010, Powell was editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin, the world's leading English language journal in art history. In 2013, Powell received the Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for Scholarly Excellence in the field of American art history from the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art, and in 2016 was honored at the College Art Association's annual conference as the year's most distinguished scholar. His forthcoming book is Going There, Black Visual Satire, which examines satirical cartoons, paintings, films, and videos by modern contemporary African American artists. Welcome.
Okay, here we go. Thank you all very much for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure to be here. I thank all of the organizers at Duke University. I want to thank Dr. Jasmine Cobb, as well as Jennifer Zhu, and everyone else who has helped to make this afternoon and two-day symposium possible. I am realize that although we're continuing to give shout outs to the two names that we know, there are many people unnamed who have really been instrumental in helping make this possible. I also, however, am really keen on the idea of the title of this project, of Black Images, Black Histories, and thinking about what Professor Powell mentioned yesterday at the Titus lecture or conversation about this sort of multiplicity of histories. And so that brought me to this thinking around the work of the late experimental documentary filmmaker Marlon Riggs, who I did my dissertation on, whose last film, Black Is, Black Ain't, and that sort of thought around the dialectics and the sort of conversations around the various identities of Blackness. And so when you're thinking about icons and you're thinking about aesthetic, it is something that is often very multi-layered and has multiplicities of sort of stories and points of entry. That just sort of keeps me in mind in terms of the way in which I come to my work, and this idea of different ways of looking and seeing people, seeing art, seeing history. And that, again, is at the core of my curatorial practice. I'm drawn to this sort of notion of everyday experiences that often feel mundane, but demonstrate a beauty, a resilience, and fortitude of community. in thinking through curatorial practice, I keep in mind a few things. And I was asked for this project, for what I'm to do, to sort of speak about my work, to speak about sort of the research and the work that I'm doing currently, and so some of the things that I have done. And so that will sort of foreground the ways in which we understand my presentation today. So when thinking about my curatorial practice, I see this as a work of service. I'm in the service to the artist, to the culture, and inevitably to humanity. And that also, something that the late writer and filmmaker Tony K. Bambara mentioned, which is that the job of the storyteller is to make revolution irresistible. And so when I am looking at doing exhibitions, I keep that in mind as well. And then finally, that the value, that cultural value is present in people and places from all walks of life. And sometimes, especially in working in institutions and museums, that, while for many of you may feel as though that is a fairly sort of matter-of-fact or sort of obvious notion, coming from a place that, I guess in essence, what I'm saying is that I look to sort of really decolonize the perspective in which we are understanding what is considered to be and deemed valuable and worthy of sort of being placed on the altar, monuments, if you will. So, stated in another way, when I think about my work and projects, I'm asking myself, who is it for? How is this work or this project transforming experiences? And what new conversations can come from the project? Of course, one is probably more effective in doing this at times than others, but nonetheless, this is sort of how or as Paula Giddens would say, this is when and where I enter. So that brings me to the presentation for today, but before moving any further, I want to share a little bit of information about the place in which I work. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. This is a place that is about 3.5 years old at this point. I want to also recognize and give a shout out to Professor Powell, Rick Powell, who has been a stalwart sort of supporter and advisor, and is part of our scholarly advisory committee and has provided countless hours and commitment and dedication to helping this monument and this museum to become the success that it is today. And that's because we've had brilliant minds like his and many, many others, Deb Willis, whose name has come up several times today, and so many others that have truly helped us to make the museum possible. And one of those people whose names I cannot forget would be John Franklin. John Franklin, to whom this project is dedicated, was instrumental in helping bring the museum forward, along with many, many others. But one of the values that he sort of espoused that continues really as a narrative through line for the museum is that we are committed, dedicated to telling the unvarnished truth, unvarnished truths, if you will. And so that is one thing, we're here in North Carolina. I must recognize John Hope Franklin. We're here in a space dedicated to him, or at least an institute. This is also an institution that sits on 14th and Constitution. I feel like, there are no there's fraught ironies in all of that. Across the street from the White House, in a place that was literally swampland that we had to create literally a bathtub at the bottom to establish and make sure that the space would maintain its sort of engineering and its integrity. The way in which this 500,000 square foot building is designed by not only David Ajay, but North Carolina's own Phil Freelon. Yes, let's give who was dedicated and committed to architecture and landscapes and African American cultural expression in a way that is par excellence. So all of this sort of brings us to this institution that has far exceeded people's expectations. To date, 3.5 years in sort of up and running and operational. We've had over 7 million visitors. That far exceeds anyone's expectations, but I think it really speaks to the power of, creating opportunities for transformative conversations to occur. The need for there to be this decolonized, if you will, understanding of the ways in which America and American history is sort of integrated into a variety of different understandings of sort of the development of this nation. And with that in mind, it is designed such that the lower levels start off the 1400s and move to 2008, the first inauguration of President Obama. You have here in this a contemplative court that after you have gone through the history galleries and pre-colonial period and the enslavement and Reconstruction, and the civil rights era, in moving forward into post the 60s and 2008, you have this contemplative court. So there's all of this sort of deliberate thinking in terms of the design of how people can process this information, understand this information, and you move forward and move up into our cultural, to our community floors and our cultural galleries. So there are 13 galleries. We started off with zero objects, and we moved on to having more than 45,000 objects now. That doesn't include a broad swath of archives, moving image archives, as well as paper and photography. And we have all of these sort of exhibitions span visual art, theater, music, cultural expression, education, entrepreneurs, sports, the politics of place, the power of place, and as I already said, history from 1400 to 2008. So when people typically come, if they can get a ticket, which takes 3 months to get, they often will be sort of struck by the size and scale and often say that they need more time. But need more time in the space. But ultimately, what I think happens is, or the foundation of this museum, and again, getting back to sort of the work and the things that I'm interested in, is that it's based upon the generosity of the people of everyday people like yourselves. So it's really about demystifying sort of the history of mythologizing, sort of who's deemed worthy to be in a museum. And I think that is what really connects with folks. But it's this notion that the people were willing to dig through their attics and basements to share some of their most treasured images and objects, and that these family heirlooms are the cornerstone of our story, of the American story, and that, as it's been said, most history is local. So therefore, if it would make sense that, as opposed to sort of going and getting loans from all of these sort of behemoth institutions that are deemed to be worthy, that we would actually go to the people and talk to folks, and then from there, we're able to tell from that very specific and local story this national kind of or regional story. It allows people to make connections, similar to what my colleague Dr. Darcy said, just Darcy, as Darcy said, with the minimalism that we saw from Maya Lin's work, when you can just place the name there without this hierarchical approach, one is able to then make connections with their own selves, and that allows people to imagine the various ways in which we can connect with a particular story. And this is the way in which I think that the work that we're doing is one of the ways in which the work that we're doing, that I'm privy to be a part of, is helping people to connect with and resonate with people. And again, the work that I'm looking to do is helping, I think, become a symbol for freedom, resilience, fortitude, and community. And then that, in my thinking, the beauty of vernacular photography or found photographs reveals stories about everyday life of the United States. You get to see births and deaths and education and weddings. And so I took that concept and of thinking about this every day, and I was struck by this 1861 quote from Frederick Douglass that said, "Daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, photographs, and electrotypes, good and bad, now adorn or disfigure all our dwellings. Men of all conditions may see themselves as others see them. What was once the exclusive luxury of the rich and great is now within reach of all." Now, he did this in 1861, and I find this to be more true now with the proliferation of our cell phones and, all of the social media, that he was being extremely prescient with this, but he was also writing this in a time when, African Americans were considered less than, not human, and that he was arguing and fighting for us to be able to insert ourselves within a conversation as it related to citizenry. But this notion of this proliferated, everyday visual landscape allows us to think about the ways in which our everyday no longer becomes an exclusive luxury, but is something that we can all celebrate and adore and explore. And so from that, I as many curators or people here, I go to the text, I go to the objects, the materiality, to really spark and get ideas. And I came up with this idea of everyday beauty. And I used this Rothstein image of a man, I think it's entitled The Unemployed Young Boy, Unemployed. I can't remember the exact title, excuse me, I'm sorry. But with it, it was part of a whole story that was told in Life magazine or Time magazine that looked at a young man from Alabama. But that became the signature image, and this is a small space within the museum on the second floor that's part of the Center for African American Media Arts, where we do rotating curating exhibitions. And there was an opportunity to showcase some of these works that are within our collection, also highlighting many of the found films that I'm also actively working on collecting that are part of, home movies, and really allow us this opportunity to sort of create agency, if you will, in terms of who gets to tell particular stories. And this particular show is also, or was also, sort of conscious in showcasing the original objects. A lot of the material within the museum has reproduced images, or you have, I should also point out as an aside, one interesting survey. While we've had 7 million people at our museum, we have learned that more than 2/3 of the visitors they state this is the first cultural institution they've ever gone to. So in my mind, it's important to have a space that is showcasing the original object, not a reproduced object, that allows people, even though you can have on your label facsimile, reproduction, it's still, there's something about being able to have individuals see the actual object, the silver gelatin print, the tin type, etc. It was still striking that we have more than 2/3 of people who say they've never attended a cultural institution, but within that, there's also a beauty because we have intergenerational audiences that come. So you have a grandmother with her child and her grandchild, and they're able to look at something, a photograph, for instance, and then have a dialogue and exchange amongst themselves and make those connections. So within this particular show, it was really important that that I highlighted and articulated the various areas in which I saw this everyday beauty. The first image, or the first sort of section, it was a thematic show that looks at the power of images in terms of self-representation, the ways in which a tool for self-expression of Black lives and grace and dignity are used and sort of seen through the lens, in particular, of African-American photographers. I thought that was critical to be able to articulate as much as possible. And it is one of the sort of efforts that I and several of my colleagues work on in terms of diligently and deliberately looking for the work of African-American photographers who's oftentimes been overlooked or ignored, especially as it relates to historical, now it's very, in contemporary standpoint, sort of the collecting of African-American photographers or artwork in particular is, sort of de rigueur, or the sort of choice of the day. But at the time, there have been many who have been overlooked. So it was important to also include that. And so one of the pieces in terms of self-representation I thought was important to include was the work of Jamel Shabazz. Jamel Shabazz, as many of you may already know, he did a wonderful book, and much of this is a sort of part of his project from the 80s that looked at, as he called it, a time before crack, that really focused on the work in a lot of photography in New York. He is a New York-based photographer who he had mentioned to me, spent a lot of time, or was a former corrections officer, also Vietnam veteran, and really kind of saw these images, and after coming back from Vietnam, really found walking and doing street photography, going down on Delancey Street, walking through the streets of Brooklyn and Harlem, and seeing sort of African Americans in their everyday joy, experiencing not only the pain or sort of these pejorative sort of descriptions of African American experiences, but these other sort of self-possessed and self-proclaimed sort of ways in which people choose to recognize and articulate and sort of pose, he felt that that was truly kind of, sort of really spoke to the Black images and the Black histories that people will often adorn and wear and showcase. And so it was important for me to not only collect his work, but also celebrate and recognize that within this sort of long-standing tradition and this proliferation that Douglass talks about in terms of images, that there have been these sort of behind-the-scenes activists like Shabazz that have been really sort of using their camera as a way to culturally agitate the ways in which we understand African American presence, and irrespective of this notion of Black men as aggressive, or this thought of young women in some sort of negative light, that he wanted to sort of showcase the dapper ways in which men like the rude boy in the center are highlighting their West Indian and cultural and their West Indian sort of backgrounds and heritages through their gold chains and the rings, and all of these things are sort of embodiments of this idea around self-representation. Also, this idea around twinning is really critical in his work, and it helps, I think, when we're playing out this idea around multiple histories and multiple identities, that he is looking at sort of the ways in which people can have multiple sides to themselves, and so I really appreciate and wanted to bring that sort of this idea of, again, self-representation into this project and this work. This exhibition then, or within that, I also looked at this very sort of important idea of education and uplift, which you see a lot of as you're looking through sort of the lives of everyday people. And I wanted to sort of acknowledge Addison Scurlock. Addison Scurlock, another North Carolina, was born in 1900, moved to DC in 1917, worked with Moses Rice and apprenticed under Moses Rice, who was a sort of well-known photographer on Photography Row on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, DC. And really, Addison's work was focused on the call that was being brought forth by people like Frederick Douglass and even Du Bois about using photography as this way of sort of supporting this notion of citizenry. And so here you have to my right, I guess, these two images who we don't know who the actual photographer is. And I actually think that I love it because you see these kids, DC, having this wonderful birthday party, but then in the background here, you have someone walking up through the stairs, walking to the house in a hat, and Addison often wore a hat. So I'm wondering if, this was one of his children's birthdays, and his son is actually here. So it's a birthday party for one of his sons and him, or at least someone walking up. So we weren't sure how to attribute this. I couldn't attribute it naturally to him. Nonetheless, this comes from his photo album, and I was able to get this donated to us from his granddaughter. The Jackie Scurlock donated this family photo album, which really sort of opened up all of these other ways in which we can understand not only Scurlock as a photographer, but as a husband, as a businessman. This is someone who had a photo studio, one of the longest standing photo studios in DC. It was 90 years, consistent photo studio that took some of the most profoundly beautiful and important photos, and it was even quoted noted that if you did not have your wedding photo taken by Scurlock, you didn't get married. So this is a way in which we understand the importance and the value of African-American photographers and artists, and how they have been able to hail and sort of recognize and promote and create a presence at a moment when there has been a historical erasure and invisibility. And he often, again, not only espoused family and sort of social activities like the Boy Scouts, or the Scouts, but also education. And again, this notion of inserting these kind of, again, everyday living opportunities or experiences in this very regal and sort of what would you call it, responsible way of sort of respectable way, is really sort of a part of the aesthetic that he was able to espouse, but it also speaks again to this notion of creating pathways at a time when it was often considered, Black people were considered not necessary and sort of irresponsible or sort of worthy of historical documentation. So that in mind, I also made it was important to look at courtship and family. And I wanted to consider the work of Henry Clay Anderson, who is an important figure who really focused on the work of Greenville, Mississippi, specifically. And so again, thinking about these iconic images, when one thinks of Mississippi, there's often, the work of, or the experience of Emmett Till, Money, Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi, and these very sort of pejorative racial imaginations come to mind. However, within that, and this is the other key point, within all of these sort of negative experiences, there has constantly been, other activities that take place, weddings and education and births. And so having something like this work of a couple on their wedding day in the 50s is really critical, I think, for us to be able to showcase this duplicity, the celebrations that happened in the midst of so much also tragedy that goes on in our lives. And there was also another section that we focused on within this, which was work and play. And I look at the work of Lloyd Yearwood. And Lloyd Yearwood was called the photographer, the Dean of Harlem, worked primarily between the 50s, 40s, and 70s. And this one is, I think, a great fun photograph that looks at, sort of unicycle, boys playing unicycle basketball, sort of making a way out of no way, if you will. And there's also this idea around faith and activism. And these elements, I think, really sort of grounded this particular exhibition. This project, this work by Zoon Lee that looked at, the Ferguson and uprisings, and really speak to the tensions that take place within the African American experience. You have this, the foreground of this flag, but you also have the protests, and that constant sort of battle is what I think lies at the crux of what we are dealing with not only within the museum or within the work, but the ways in which I try to sort of create and examine that tension. So that was just one project. The next, or another show that I've just recently closed, that again looks at this idea that I brought forth in the beginning, was a show called Represent, HipHop photography. And this showcased photographs from a collection that we have at the museum, the iJammy HipHop photo collection. And these were photos that present hip-hop's iconic figures and moments, and they were paired alongside some of our more historical images and historic figures of art and culture and dance. Because what I wanted to do within this, it's one thing, you know, to have a collection of hip-hop images, right? And people, again, that can conjure up a whole host of iconic visions and memories for people. But for me, in my work, it's important to sort of ground it within a historical context as well. And so what I ended up doing was making these diptychs and pairing the way in which something is on a continuum. So I had the work of Gladys Bentley, this portrait of Gladys Bentley, that was taken, and Gladys Bentley was a Harlem performer who was often was considered or cross-dressed or dressed in drag, and eventually ended up changing her appearance over time. Nonetheless, I paired her with someone else who has had often, at least their sexual identity has been placed in question, and has never necessarily articulated it in one way or the other, but this was the way in which I wanted to pair these two works and allow us to have this conversation again between sort of the past and the present. And this is another example where I take a photo from Teenie Harris of Duke Ellington, Alfredo Gustar, and Billy Strayhorn, and I pair it with a work from the 80s by Harry Allen that looks at Terminator X, between sort of the idea of his foot most likely making some sort of movement and action and sound, whereas the DJ is constantly using that sort of notion of repetition and sort of movement to create a new sound. Hip hop is all about sort of, and music is about sort of remixing, refiguring, reconstructing the ways in which we understand something that is already established. I would say African American identity or African American history has also done that as well. Taken something that we may know, we may understand in one particular way, and revisioning it, reframing it, restructuring it so that we can see another sort of form of sort of resilient structure and fortitude. And this image, I thought, also very nicely sort of allows us to see the continuum in which these sort of histories have grown and shifted over time. And so these are just two examples of the way in which this exhibition really sort of broke up, so it was broken down within sort of using the elements of hip hop, from DJing to breakdancing and graffiti arts, and use that same sort of idea and extrapolate it from it, sort of these ideas of activism, community, creativity that also sort of are sort of outgrowths of the elements of hip hop, and then again use that in this very sort of paired way to understand how our lives are sort of on this sort of creative continuum. And the current show that I have up is looking at the ways in which posters from African American movies, really starting from like the 1912, the first African American film, 1912, and moving up to blaxploitation. And I sort of look at the ways in which graphic art has really kind of had to deal with this notion of commerce and sort of the ways in which we integrate or sort of challenge, or not challenge, but the ways in which we take art and how that sort of creates a sort of social understanding of who we are. And how is that idea sort of complicated when you're looking at African American images? What does it mean when in many of the instances, particularly in early posters, the African American art director was, or the art director, excuse me, was not African American? So how is the idea around Black images being sold to us, and what is that message saying, and how did that shift over time? And so within this exhibition, I have it again sort of, because the space is one that is cozy, I'll say, is a cozy space. I have to sort of think creatively about how I can tell a story and sort of create this sort of narrative through line that will make sense and people won't feel necessarily super claustrophobic. And so with this one, I wanted it to sort of feel like you were entering into a 1920s or 30s movie theater. There are sconces that unfortunately you can't see within these install shots, but I sort of painted it with this sort of details and sort of the way in which what do you call it? The molding, thank you, is sort of highly ornate, so that when you walked in, you felt as though you were walking into an old theater. And I even created within the space a small movie theater so that you can see films that you can see films from as early as what is my earliest film? I have Oscar Michaud. I'm showing The Exile, a clip of The Exile, and then I have a Go Down Death, a film by Spencer Williams, that really highlight sort of the range in which African American images or films have shifted over time. But another sort of way in which we wanted to activate this space was using augmented reality. So this is the first time that the museum has included augmented reality in an exhibition, so that this was an opportunity for me to, again, address this challenge of the space that we're dealing with, and engage a variety of different visitors and viewers. It is this. It is basically using a technology to create another sort of experience for the visitor. It is often something that is used on a phone, or somehow it provides you with another sort of dimensionality to experience the work, but it's technological. And then, so within this the outgrowth of this project has allowed me to work on another project that I'm excited about, that is with the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures based in Los Angeles, that's opening at the end of this year. And this is a project that is called Regeneration, Black Cinema from 1900 to 1970. And this project is really going to explore the ways in which the history of African American filmmaking has sort of shifted over time. As many of you know, this 1898 work, which is a 28-second sort of kiss of two African Americans, is the first sort of moving image project that is showing sort of African Americans within this sort of artistic aesthetic and beauty and kiss and intimacy. And it has really sort of blown the roof off of the ways in which people have understood the African American presence within visual art, or at least moving art and film. And it's paired with this work by Glenn Ligon that looks at sort of the notion of double consciousness and the ways in which African Americans have had to navigate sort of their presence within American, sort of within America. And this is a large scale exhibition that will really highlight lost films or works that have been considered lost. It's going to look at the ways in which there are many African American artists and actors who have been erased from the books that we will be bringing forward and showcasing, and also sort of looking at sort of how African American presence really influenced and impacted the film industry without getting its proper recognition. So this is a project that I'm slated to open at the end of next year. And I will wrap up by, again, sort of highlighting some of the other projects that I've been working on, which Jasmine mentioned, which was this 7-series project, Double Exposure, that again really is looking at the ways in which African Americans over time and highlighting, not over time, but highlighting the various elements that are part of our growing photography collection, and making sure that we have sort of a document of the works in which we have been privileged enough to be a part of collecting. And it's the one sort of last bit that I think is really important is this notion of home movies. And this is part of our Great Migration Home Movie Project. And this is from the Marshall family, and they had just arrived at their family reunion. So the caption tells it all. And it was important, I think, to sort of highlight that home movies, again, getting back to that idea about self-representation, about the fact that there has been a long-standing history of people who have allowed us to, or there have been, our own families have been the progenitors of telling our stories. And with that in mind, I wanted to showcase this piece. It's a short clip. And this comes from J. Max Bond. This is material from the 40s that he shot. Max Bond also that I think is remarkable. When he was going out to do work in the South, he wanted to make sure that he's filming these young people. This is Cab Calloway home movies. We see Cab Calloway in one particular way, but again, the duplicity, the histories of people, their families. He's a family man. That's his daughter, Cabela. This is work from the Bedford-Stuyvesant Youth in Action Project, which was a project in the sort of 60s that was really utilizing, and Kennedy, Robert Kennedy was involved in it, utilizing sort of funding to make sure there was community work going on. And this is S.S. Jones, whose work is now in the National Film Registry collection, that was shot from 1924 to 1928 in Oklahoma. And it shows sort of life in Oklahoma after the Tulsa riots. And this work was critical to sort of highlight for us the ways in which everyday beauty exists and has existed over time. Thank you so much.